Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most transformative periods in American history, the Civil War. But here's the thing, we're not just talking about battles and generals. We're going to explore something far more interesting, how this war, fought over 160 years ago, literally created the America we live in today. When most people think about the Civil War, they picture Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg, or maybe Gone with the Wind. But the truth is, the Civil War didn't just end slavery, though that was absolutely monumental. It fundamentally rewired the DNA of the United States in ways that affect your daily life right now, whether you realize it or not. Think about it. The size and power of the federal government, income taxes, the very concept of American citizenship, civil rights movements, even the food you eat and the way our economy works, all of these trace their roots back to those 4 years of conflict from 1861 to 1865. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's explore how the bloodiest war in American history, claiming over 600,000 lives, forged the nation we know today. And hey, if you enjoy this deep dive into history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Before the Civil War, the United States wasn't really all that united. Stay with me here. A loose confederation. In the early 1800s, most Americans identified more strongly with their state than with the nation as a whole. People would say, these United States, rather than the United States. Plural, not singular. The federal government was tiny, weak, and honestly, pretty unimportant in most people's daily lives. Most of what government did happened at the state or local level. The federal government had so few employees that they could all fit in a few buildings in Washington, D.C. There was no national currency, no income tax, no real bureaucracy to speak of. The idea that the federal government could tell states what to do was highly controversial and often rejected outright. The war changes everything, but then came the Civil War, and everything changed. Almost overnight, the federal government had to become massive and powerful. Why? Because you can't fight the largest war in American history with a small, weak central government. The Union government had to raise enormous armies. Eventually, over 2 million men would serve. It had to feed them, clothe them, arm them, and pay them. It had to build railroads, manufacture weapons on an industrial scale, and coordinate operations across a vast geographic area. This required a complete transformation. The federal government created entirely new agencies and departments. The Department of Agriculture was established in 1862. The Bureau of Internal Revenue, the predecessor to the IRS, was created the same year. The government started printing a national currency, the greenback, for the first time. These weren't temporary war measures. They became permanent features of American government. The income tax, a revolutionary concept. Here's something that will blow your mind. Before the Civil War, there was no federal income tax. The government raised money mainly through tariffs on imported goods. But war is expensive, and tariffs weren't enough. In 1861, Congress passed the Revenue Act, creating the first federal income tax in American history. Initially, it was just 3% on incomes over $800, about $25,000 in today's money. This was revolutionary and deeply controversial. Many people saw it as tyrannical government overreach. But here's the kicker. Even though the income tax was repealed after the war, the precedent was set. Once the government knew it could tax income, that genie wasn't going back in the bottle. When the federal government needed money again for World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the income tax came roaring back, and this time it stayed for good. Today, federal income tax is just a fact of life. Every April 15th, you're experiencing a direct legacy of the Civil War. From these United States to the United States. Perhaps most importantly, the Civil War settled the fundamental question of American government. Could states leave the Union? The Confederacy said yes. The Union said absolutely not. The Union won, and that question was answered permanently. After 1865, secession was off the table. The United States really did become a single, indivisible nation rather than a loose association of sovereign states. This shift in thinking, from plural to singular, might sound subtle, but it was earth-shattering. The federal government emerged from the war as the supreme power in the land. States still had significant authority, but never again could they challenge federal supremacy on fundamental issues. This balance of power between federal and state governments continues to shape American politics today. Now let's talk about something even more fundamental: what it means to be an American citizen. Before the Civil War, this was actually a murky, poorly defined concept. The war forced America to figure it out. Who is a citizen? Before the Civil War, citizenship was confusing. Were you a citizen of your state first and the United States second, or the other way around? Different people had different opinions. And what about Black Americans? The infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that Black people, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States. This was the law of the land in 1860. The Civil War blew this whole system apart. When the Confederacy lost and slavery was abolished, America faced a critical question. What was the legal status of 4 million formerly enslaved people? Were they citizens? Did they have rights? This wasn't just a philosophical question. It would determine the future of the nation. The Reconstruction Amendments. The answer came in the form of 3 constitutional amendments: the 13th, 14th, and 15th, collectively known as the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments didn't just tinker around the edges of the Constitution. They fundamentally rewrote the American social contract. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery. Pretty straightforward, right? But it was just the beginning. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, was truly revolutionary. Let me read you the key passage. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Do you see what that did? For the first time in American history, the Constitution defined citizenship clearly and inclusively. If you're born here, you're a citizen. Period. No exceptions for race. But the 14th Amendment went further. It said that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. These 2 clauses, due process and equal protection, have become the basis for most civil rights law in America. Everything from Brown versus Board of Education ending school segregation, to Loving v's Virginia legalizing interracial marriage, to Obergefell versus Hodges legalizing same-sex marriage. All of these landmark decisions were based on the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, guaranteed that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, we have to be honest, this promise wasn't fully realized for another century. Southern states found ways to circumvent it through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. But the principle was established, and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was essentially about forcing America to live up to the promises made in these Reconstruction amendments. The legacy of birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship, established by the 14th Amendment, remains a defining feature of American identity. It's one of the most generous citizenship laws in the world. Many countries require that at least one parent be a citizen for a child born there to receive citizenship. Not America. If you're born on American soil, you're an American. This has shaped immigration patterns, national identity, and political debates right up to the present day. Current debates about immigration and citizenship are essentially debates about whether we should maintain this Civil War era principle. The Civil War didn't end racism or create racial equality. We need to be very clear about that. But it did begin a long, ongoing struggle for African American freedom and equality that continues to shape American society. From slavery to freedom, an incomplete revolution. When the war ended, 4 million people who had been enslaved were suddenly free. This was the largest emancipation of enslaved people in history. Think about the magnitude of that transformation. One day, you're someone's property with no rights whatsoever. The next day, you're free. But free to do what? Most formerly enslaved people had no land, no money, no education, no legal rights that were effectively enforced. Freedom without resources is incomplete freedom. During Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, there was a brief, shining moment when it seemed like real racial equality might be possible. Black men voted. Black men held political office. In fact, more black people held political office during Reconstruction than at any time until the 1990s. Black communities built schools, churches, and economic institutions. But this progress was violently overthrown. After federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, white supremacist Redeemer governments took over. They implemented Jim Crow laws that created a system of legal segregation and disenfranchisement that lasted until the 1960s, the long civil rights movement. Here's the key point. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s wasn't something new. It was the continuation of a struggle that began during the Civil War. The movement was about making America live up to the promises of the Reconstruction Amendments. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and said, 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he was explicitly connecting the Civil Rights Movement to the Civil War. He was saying, Lincoln started this work, but it remains unfinished. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, these weren't new inventions. They were attempts to finally enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, nearly a century after they were ratified. Modern racial issues, the war's unfinished business. Today, debates about racial justice, police reform, affirmative action, reparations for slavery, and systemic racism are all, in a sense, debates about the unfinished business of the Civil War. The question remains, what does true equality look like in a country where racial slavery was the foundation of the economy for 250 years, followed by another century of legal segregation? How do you create genuine equality in a society built on inequality? These aren't easy questions, and Americans continue to disagree about the answers. But the fact that we're still having these debates shows how profoundly the Civil War and the system of slavery it ended continues to shape American life. Let's shift gears and talk about money, business, and the economy. The Civil War didn't just transform government and citizenship, it transformed how Americans made a living and how the economy worked. The South, from plantation to poverty. Before the war, the South had an economy based almost entirely on agriculture and slave labor. Cotton was king, and the entire Southern economy was organized around producing it using enslaved workers. The South had very little industry, few railroads, and little economic diversity. The war destroyed this system completely. Plantations were burned, infrastructure was wrecked, the enslaved workforce was freed without compensation to enslavers, which destroyed planter wealth, and the South's economy collapsed. After the war, the South remained poor for generations. Well into the 20th century, per capita income in the South was roughly half that of the North for decades. This regional economic disparity is a direct legacy of the Civil War. The South developed a new system called sharecropping, where formerly enslaved people and poor whites would farm land owned by others in exchange for a share of the crop. It wasn't slavery, but it often wasn't much better. Sharecroppers were trapped in cycles of debt and poverty. The South didn't really catch up economically until after World War II, when air conditioning, interstate highways, and industrial development finally brought the region into the modern economy. Even today, if you look at maps of poverty and economic development in America, you can still see the shadow of the Civil War. The North, industrial boom. While the South struggled, the North boomed. The war accelerated Northern industrialization dramatically. The need to supply massive armies with everything from uniforms to weapons to food created enormous demand for manufactured goods. Northern factories expanded rapidly. Railroads boomed. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, just 4 years after the war ended, partly because the federal government could now support it without Southern opposition. The war also created a new class of wealthy industrialists. Men who supplied the Union Army made fortunes. After the war, these industrialists used their capital to build the railroads, steel mills, and factories that would make America an industrial superpower by 1900. The birth of big business. The Civil War marked the beginning of the era of big business in America. Before the war, most businesses were small, local, and family owned. After the war, you started to see the emergence of large corporations that operated nationally. Why? Partly because the war showed what could be achieved with large scale organization and mass production. The Union Army's logistics system, feeding, clothing, and arming over 1 million men spread across thousands of miles, was the most complex organizational system ever created up to that point. After the war, businessmen applied these lessons to create large corporations. The war also created infrastructure that made big business possible. National railroad networks, telegraph systems, standardized banking, all of these were accelerated by the war and made national markets possible. Labor and the working class. The rise of big business created a new kind of worker, the industrial laborer. Before the Civil War, most Americans were farmers or craftsmen who owned their own tools and controlled their own work. After the war, more and more Americans became wage workers in factories. This created new social tensions and new forms of conflict. If you've ever heard of labor unions, strikes, or workers' rights, these movements really began in the post Civil War era. The great labor battles of the late 19th century, the railroad strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair, the Homestead Strike, were all consequences of the economic transformation triggered by the Civil War. Beyond government and economics, the Civil War transformed American identity and culture in ways that might be less obvious but are equally important, from regional to national. Before the Civil War, Americans were deeply regional. A farmer in Vermont and a planter in Georgia had almost nothing in common. They spoke differently, ate different food, practiced different forms of Christianity, and had completely different economies and lifestyles. The war forced Americans from different regions to interact on a massive scale. Northern soldiers fought across the South. They saw different ways of life. After the war, soldiers returned home with broader perspectives and connections to people from other regions. The war also created shared national experiences. Nearly every community, North and South, lost young men in the war. This shared sacrifice, however tragic, created a sense of common national identity. The cult of the lost cause. We have to talk about this because it's still affecting us today. After the war, white Southerners developed what historians call the lost cause mythology. This was the idea that the Confederacy had been noble and heroic, fighting for states' rights and Southern honor rather than for slavery, and that they lost only because the North had more men and resources. This was historically false. Confederate leaders were quite explicit that they were fighting to preserve slavery, but the lost cause became powerful mythology. It led to the construction of thousands of Confederate monuments, mostly erected not right after the war, but during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, as statements of white supremacy. The debates we have today about Confederate monuments, the Confederate flag, and how to remember the Civil War are all part of this long struggle over memory and meaning. Should we honor Confederate soldiers? Were they traitors or heroes? How do we remember a war fought to preserve slavery? These remain hotly contested questions. Veterans and Memorial Day. Here's something you might not know. Memorial Day started as a way to honor Union soldiers killed in the Civil War. It was originally called Decoration Day, and communities would decorate the graves of fallen soldiers. Over time, Memorial Day expanded to honor all American war dead, but its origins lie in the Civil War. The same is true for our entire culture of honoring military veterans. The enormous scale of sacrifice in the Civil War, over 2% of the entire American population died, created a new sense that the nation owed a debt to those who served in uniform. The Grand Army of the Republic, an organization of Union veterans, became one of the most powerful political and social organizations in late 19th century America. It pioneered many of the veterans' benefits and services we now take for granted. When we talk about the VA, veterans, pensions, or military cemeteries, we're talking about systems that began with Civil War veterans, national symbols, and anthems. The Civil War also gave us many of our most enduring national symbols. The Battle Hymn of the Republic was written during the war. Patriotic songs and imagery that emerged from the war became part of American culture. The flag became much more important as a national symbol. Before the war, displaying the American flag was relatively uncommon. After the war, the flag became a sacred object. a symbol of national unity, flag etiquette, pledges to the flag desecration laws. All of this emerged from the Civil War's transformation of the flag into a powerful national symbol. Let's get a bit more into the legal weeds, because this is fascinating. The Civil War changed how Americans thought about rights, liberties, and what the Constitution means. From state rights to individual rights. Before the Civil War, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, only applied to the federal government. States could, in theory, violate your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, your right to a jury trial, and the Constitution wouldn't stop them. Why? Because that's how it was originally understood. The Bill of Rights was meant to limit the federal government, not state governments. Each state had its own constitution with its own protections. The 14th Amendment changed this, though it took decades for the full implications to be realized. Remember that clause about due process? Over time, the Supreme Court interpreted this to mean that most of the rights in the Bill of Rights also apply to state governments through a process called incorporation. Freedom of speech, that applies to state governments too, because of the 14th Amendment. Freedom of religion, same thing. Right to bear arms, that's been incorporated too. This process, called incorporation doctrine, is entirely a product of the Civil War amendments. Expanding federal power. More broadly, the war established that the federal government has implied powers beyond those explicitly listed in the Constitution. The scale and scope of federal action during the war, drafting soldiers, issuing a currency, confiscating property, emancipating enslaved people, would have been unthinkable before 1861. After the war, this broader interpretation of federal power became normal. When the federal government wants to do something, regulate the environment, provide health care, build interstate highways, whatever, it can often point back to precedents established during the Civil War era. This doesn't mean all expansions of federal power are good or bad. That's for you to decide based on your values. But it does mean that the Civil War fundamentally altered the balance of power in American government. Modern constitutional debates. Today, many of our biggest constitutional debates are really debates about Civil War era changes to the Constitution. Should the federal government or states have more power? What does equal protection really mean? What are the limits of federal authority? Conservatives often emphasize federalism and states' rights, while liberals tend to emphasize national standards and federal protection of individual rights. But both sides are operating within a constitutional framework that was radically altered by the Civil War. The Civil War also transformed how Americans thought about military service and established the United States as a military power. The citizen soldier. Before the Civil War, America had a tiny standing army, usually fewer than 20,000 soldiers. The idea of a large permanent military was seen as dangerous to liberty. But the Civil War required mass mobilization. Over 2 million men served in the Union Army, and about 750,000 to 1 million served in the Confederate Army. For the first time, military service became a common American experience. The idea of the citizen soldier, an ordinary person who serves in time of war, became central to American identity. This pattern continued. In World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, America relied on mass mobilization of citizens through conscription. Even today, with an all-volunteer military, the idea that military service is an honorable duty of citizenship traces back to the Civil War. Total war. The Civil War also introduced Americans to the concept of total war, war that targets not just armies, but entire societies. General Sherman's march to the sea, which destroyed infrastructure and supplies across Georgia and the Carolinas, was designed to break the South's will to fight by making war so terrible that people would demand peace. This was controversial then and remains controversial now, but it established a precedent. American wars since, World War II especially, have involved targeting enemy societies, not just enemy armies. Strategic bombing, economic sanctions, these are all forms of total war. America as a military power. The Civil War also gave America experience in large-scale military operations. The armies, the logistics, the strategies developed during the Civil War were studied by military thinkers around the world. When America entered World War I in 1917, it could draw on this experience. When America became a superpower after World War II, the tradition of the massive citizen army began in the Civil War. Today, America has the most powerful military in world history. That didn't happen by accident. It's the result of a long evolution that began when the Union mobilized millions of men to fight the Confederacy. Here's something that might surprise you. The modern welfare state, government programs that provide social services, has roots in the Civil War. Pensions for veterans. The Union government promised pensions to soldiers disabled in the war and to widows of soldiers killed in action. This seems obvious to us now, but it was revolutionary at the time. These Civil War pensions became the first large-scale social welfare program in American history. By 1893, pension expenditures consumed over 40% of the entire federal budget. Nearly 1 million people were receiving pensions. This established several important precedents. First, it established that the federal government could and should provide direct financial assistance to citizens. Second, it created a bureaucracy to administer benefits. Third, it created political constituencies who depended on and defended these benefits. When progressives in the early 20th century argued for old age pensions and social insurance, they pointed to Civil War pensions as proof that such programs were both feasible and proper. Social Security, established in 1935, was in many ways an extension of principles first established with Civil War pensions. Government as economic actor. The Civil War also established that the government could and should play an active role in the economy. The Union government built railroads, established land-grant colleges through the Morrill Act of 1862, gave away land to homesteaders through the Homestead Act of 1862, and generally took an active role in promoting economic development. Before the war, government involvement in the economy was limited and controversial. After the war, it became normal. The New Deal, the Great Society, modern infrastructure spending, all of these draw on precedents established during the Civil War. The Civil War was the first truly modern war, and it accelerated technological development in ways that shaped the modern world. The railroad-age railroads existed before the Civil War, but the war made them essential. The Union's rail network allowed it to move troops and supplies quickly. The Confederacy's inferior rail network was a major weakness. After the war, railroad construction exploded. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was subsidized by the federal government, a direct result of the war, establishing federal involvement in infrastructure. Railroads transformed America. They made national markets possible. encouraged Western settlement, and literally tied the nation together with iron rails. The railroad age of the late 19th century was a direct consequence of the Civil War. Communications revolution. The war also accelerated the development of the telegraph. Commanders used telegraphs to communicate across vast distances, something impossible in previous wars. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to use the telegraph actively, and he practically lived in the War Department telegraph office during the war. After the war, telegraph lines spread across the country. By 1866, a transatlantic cable connected America to Europe. This communications revolution, instantaneous communication over long distances, changed business, journalism, and daily life. In a way, the telegraph was to the 19th century what the internet has been to ours, and the Civil War accelerated its adoption and development. Medical advances. The Civil War was horrifically bloody. Advances in weapons technology, especially the rifle, made killing far more efficient than in previous wars. But this tragedy drove medical innovation. The war saw the first widespread use of anesthesia in surgery. It led to better understanding of sanitation and disease prevention. The experience of treating hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers advanced the field of medicine significantly. Organizations like the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which provided medical supplies and support, were predecessors to organizations like the Red Cross. The idea of organized, large-scale medical care had its roots in Civil War hospitals, photography, and journalism. The Civil War was the first war to be extensively photographed. Matthew Brady and other photographers created thousands of images of soldiers, camps, and battlefields. For the first time, people at home could see images of what war really looked like. This changed how Americans thought about war. The romance and glory of war were harder to maintain when you could see photographs of corpses on the battlefield. War journalism and war photography, which remain important today, really began with the Civil War. The Civil War also had profound consequences for the American West and for Native American peoples, opening the West. During the war, with Southern opposition gone from Congress, Republicans passed legislation promoting Western development. The Homestead Act gave land to settlers. The Pacific Railroad Acts subsidized transcontinental railroads. The Morrill Act created land-grant colleges, many in Western states. After the war, Americans streamed west in enormous numbers. The population of Western states and territories exploded. This was partly because the war had displaced people, partly because veterans sought new opportunities, and partly because the government actively encouraged it. Tragedy for Native peoples. But this westward expansion was catastrophic for Native Americans. During and after the Civil War, the U.S. Army turned its attention from fighting Confederates to fighting Native peoples who resisted the invasion of their lands. Many Union officers who had fought in the Civil War were sent west to fight Native Americans. The tactics of total war, learned in the Civil War, targeting not just warriors, but entire societies, destroying villages and food supplies, were applied against Native peoples with devastating effect. The Plains Indian Wars of the 1860s, 1890s resulted in the destruction of Native American societies and their forced relocation to reservations. This was genocide, and it was made possible by the large, experienced army the Union had built to fight the Confederacy. The legacy of this period, broken treaties, stolen land, destroyed cultures, continues to affect Native American communities today. The Civil War didn't cause this tragedy directly, but it created the conditions that made it possible. So let's bring this all together. How did the Civil War shape the America we know today? In almost every conceivable way. The big, powerful federal government that touches every aspect of your life, from Social Security to the FDA to federal highways, emerged from the Civil War. The income tax you pay every year, Civil War. The very definition of who is an American citizen, Civil War. The idea that all Americans have equal protection under the law, even if we still struggle to achieve it, Civil War. The industrial economy, big corporations, labor unions, all of these emerged from the economic transformation triggered by the war. The idea of America as a military power with a tradition of citizen soldiers. That started with the Civil War. Our ongoing struggles with racial justice, our debates about states' rights versus federal power, our arguments about what the Constitution means. These are all, in some sense, debates about the unfinished business of the Civil War. Here's the thing that I find most striking. The Civil War was supposed to settle fundamental questions about American society. What kind of nation would we be? Would we be a slave society or a free society? Would we be a loose confederation of states or a unified nation? The war answered some of these questions decisively. Slavery was abolished. Secession was impossible. The federal government became supreme. But many questions remained open or were only partially answered. What does freedom really mean? What does equality require? How do we build a truly just society? 160 years later, Americans are still debating these questions. We're still arguing about race and justice. We're still arguing about the size and role of government. We're still arguing about what it means to be an American. In that sense, we're all living in the long shadow of the Civil War. The war ended in 1865, but its consequences continue to unfold. Every generation has to grapple with the legacy of that conflict and decide what kind of nation America will be. The Civil War shaped the America we know today, but it's up to us to shape the America of tomorrow. Will we finally fulfill the promise of equal justice under law? Will we address the ongoing consequences of slavery and racism? Will we balance individual liberty with collective responsibility? These questions remain open. History isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how the past created the present and using that understanding to build a better future. The Civil War gave us both our greatest tragedies and our highest ideals. It's up to us to learn from the tragedies and live up to the ideals. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this gave you a new appreciation for how profoundly the Civil War shaped modern America. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. What aspect of the Civil War's legacy do you find most interesting or important? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, history isn't just dates and battles. It's the story of how we became who we are. The more we understand our history, the better equipped we are to create our future. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring history.